The sky hung low over the plains that evening, gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. Elizabeth Hargrove stood at the crossroads outside Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1887, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's pocket watch clutched in one trembling hand. The relentless wind cut through her worn dress, but she barely felt it anymore. 3 days since the bank had taken their homestead. 2 since she'd eaten. 1 since she'd resigned herself to what must come next. A mile ahead lay the Blackthorn Ranch. Even from this distance she could make out its silhouette against the darkening horizon, a house and barn standing defiant against the vast emptiness. Folk in town spoke of its owner in hushed tones. Caleb Blackthorn, a man who'd returned from the war with half his face burned and all his hope extinguished. A man who fired at trespassers and hadn't set foot in Bitter Creek for 8 years. A man who needed help on his ranch, according to the station master who'd taken pity on her that morning. He won't take kindly to visitors, the old man had warned her, but winter's coming hard, and he can't manage alone. Elizabeth took a deep breath and pushed forward, each step crunching in the thin layer of snow. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. A Hargrove never begs. But her mother had died of fever last spring, and her father had put a bullet in his head the day the bank foreclosed. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Caleb Blackthorn was repairing fence posts when he spotted the figure approaching through his field glass. A woman, moving slowly but deliberately toward his property. He set down his tools with a curse and reached for the rifle propped against the fence. Visitors meant trouble, always had. The last time he'd allowed someone onto his land, they'd written about the monster of Blackthorn Ranch in the territorial newspaper. He'd learned his lesson then. Better to be feared than pitied. He waited until she was within 50 yards before firing a warning shot into the air. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "This is private property." The woman stopped but didn't retreat. Even from this distance he could see she was rail-thin, her clothes inadequate for the weather. "Mr. Blackthorn," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the open space. "My name is Elizabeth Hargrove. I've come about work." "Ain't hiring." He raised the rifle to his shoulder. "Turn around." She took another step forward instead, and he could see her face now. Young, maybe 25, with a stubborn set to her jaw. Pretty once before hardship had carved hollows into her cheeks. "I heard different in town. I heard you need help." "You heard wrong." He adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Last warning." Elizabeth stared down the barrel of his gun and somehow found it less frightening than the prospect of another night in the cold. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Blackthorn. My family's land is gone. I can cook, clean, tend livestock. I'll work harder than any man you could hire." She paused, swallowing her pride with visible effort. I'll do whatever is required." The implication in her words hung in the frigid air between them. Caleb lowered the rifle slightly, his expression unreadable behind the scarf that covered the lower half of his face. The scarred half. "I don't need that kind of help, Miss Hargrove." "I need shelter," she said simply. "Winter's coming." He studied her for a long moment. Something in her eyes, not fear or desperation, but a quiet resignation, stirred a memory he'd long buried. Of another woman who'd stood her ground when all hope was lost. "There's a room above the barn," he said finally. "You can sleep there. We'll discuss terms in the morning." He turned away before she could respond, unable to bear the relief that flooded her face. The room was little more than a storage loft, dusty and cold, with a small window that rattled in its frame with each gust of wind. But it had a cot with a straw mattress, and Elizabeth nearly wept at the sight of it. She hadn't slept lying down in days. She lit the oil lamp Blackthorn had grudgingly provided and examined her new home. Crates of supplies lined one wall, saddles and tack another. The air smelled of hay and leather and horses from the stalls below. not unpleasant after the sterile bite of winter. A soft knock at the ladder made her start. Blackthorn stood below, a bundle in his arms. "Blankets," he said, not meeting her eyes, "and some food." He set the items at the base of the ladder and retreated without another word. Elizabeth retrieved the bundle, finding within it 2 wool blankets, a loaf of bread, some dried beef, and an apple, wizened but edible. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour it all at once. Through the small window she could see Blackthorn's house, a substantial 2-story structure with a wide porch. A single lamp burned in a downstairs window, silhouetting his figure as he moved about. What kind of man was he? The townspeople feared him, yet he'd given her shelter and food with nothing but her word that she would work. She wondered what lay beneath the scarf he wore, what war had done to him beyond the visible scars. Elizabeth wrapped herself in the blankets and lay down on the cot, listening to the soft sounds of the horses below. For the first time in weeks, sleep came quickly. The sound of breaking glass jolted Caleb from his nightmare. He sat upright in bed, heart racing, momentarily disoriented. Then he heard it again. Breaking glass, followed by hushed voices. Not part of the dream. He reached for the revolver he kept by his bed and moved silently to the window. In the pale moonlight, he could make out 3 figures near his barn. Raiders, most likely. Desperate men driven to theft by the early winter. They weren't uncommon in these parts, but they'd never been bold enough to hit the Blackthorn Ranch before. The woman. The thought struck him with unexpected force. She was sleeping in the barn loft, defenseless. Caleb pulled on his boots and coat, not bothering with the scarf that usually covered his face. There wasn't time. He slipped out the back door and circled wide around the property, using the shadows and his intimate knowledge of the land to his advantage. When he reached the barn, one of the men was already inside. The other 2 were keeping watch, rifles ready. Caleb took aim at the nearest one. "Drop your weapons," he called out, his voice cutting through the night, "or I drop you." The men whirled toward his voice, raising their rifles. Caleb fired twice in rapid succession. The first man fell with a cry. The second got off a shot that whistled past Caleb's ear before a third bullet from Caleb's gun found its mark. The third raider burst from the barn, firing wildly. One shot grazed Caleb's arm, but he hardly felt it. He returned fire, catching the man in the chest. The raider staggered, then collapsed face down in the snow. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the moan of the wounded man. Caleb approached cautiously, kicking away the fallen rifles. "Mr. Blackthorn." Elizabeth stood in the barn doorway, clutching a pitchfork, her face pale in the moonlight. Her eyes widened as they fell on his uncovered face. Caleb turned away sharply, raising a hand to shield the ruined side of his visage, a mass of twisted scar tissue where his left eye and cheek had once been. "Are you hurt?" he asked roughly. "No." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I hid when I heard them come in." Caleb nodded, still not looking at her. "Get back inside. I'll deal with this." "You're bleeding." He glanced down at his arm where blood was soaking through his coat sleeve. "It's nothing." Elizabeth stepped forward, lowering the pitchfork. "Let me help." "I said get back inside," he snapped, harsher than he'd intended. She flinched, but didn't retreat. "Those men would have killed me if not for you," she said quietly. "At least let me tend your wound." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Caleb gave a curt nod. "There's a medicine box in the house," he said. "I need to see to the horses first. They're spooked." Elizabeth hesitated, then set down the pitchfork. "I'll calm the horses. You're injured. The medicine box? Where?" "Kitchen cupboard," he muttered, surprised by her insistence. "Above the stove." She nodded and slipped past him toward the house, careful to keep her eyes averted from the bodies in the snow. Caleb watched her go, acutely aware of his exposed face and what she must think of it. of him. Yet she hadn't recoiled or gasped or shown any of the usual reactions. Perhaps the darkness had hidden the worst of it. He turned to the wounded raider, who had fallen silent. By the time Caleb returned to the house, Elizabeth had a fire going in the kitchen stove and water heating for coffee. The medicine box sat open on the table. "The men?" she asked, not looking up from where she was tearing a clean shirt into bandage strips. "2 dead. 1 won't last till morning." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I'll bury them at first light." Elizabeth nodded, her hands steady despite the horror of what had happened. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Let me see your arm." Caleb hesitated, acutely aware that the lamplight would reveal what the darkness had concealed, but his arm was throbbing now, and blood had soaked through his sleeve to drip onto the floor. He sat stiffly, his right side toward her, and removed his coat with difficulty. "You need to take off your shirt," she said, her voice professional, detached. "Turn down the lamp first." Elizabeth met his eyes, then silently adjusted the lamp to a low glow before helping him remove his blood-soaked shirt. She worked efficiently, cleaning the wound, a deep furrow across his upper arm, applying salve from the medicine box and wrapping it in the makeshift bandages. Her fingers were gentle but firm, and Caleb found himself studying her face as she worked. Up close he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the chapped skin of her lips, the way her brown hair fell in a single braid over her shoulder. Not a beautiful woman, perhaps, but striking in her quiet composure. "Why did you come here?" he asked suddenly. "The truth." Her hands paused momentarily before resuming their work. "I told you, I needed work." "There's work in town. Safer work." Elizabeth tied off the bandage and stepped back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Not for a woman alone," she said quietly. "Not without expectations." "And you didn't think I'd have expectations?" His tone was bitter. "A man alone, out here?" "I didn't know." She met his eyes directly. "But I was willing to pay that price if necessary." The honesty in her voice struck him like a physical blow. "Jesus," he muttered, looking away. "What happened to your family?" "Bank took our land 3 days ago. My father couldn't live with the shame. Shot himself that night." She said it flatly, without tears. "I buried him beside my mother, took his watch and walked away." Caleb was silent for a long moment. "I'll pay you fair wages," he said finally. "For work, nothing more." Relief flickered across her face, so brief he almost missed it. "Thank you." "You've seen my face," he said abruptly. "Does it not disgust you?" Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I've seen worse things, Mr. Blackthorne." "Caleb," he corrected, surprising himself. "If you're staying, call me Caleb." Winter descended on the Blackthorne Ranch with merciless intensity. Blizzards swept across the plains, burying the landscape in drifts taller than a man. Inside, Elizabeth and Caleb settled into an uneasy routine. She cooked and cleaned, mended clothes, and helped with the livestock when the weather permitted. He repaired equipment, chopped endless cords of firewood, and wrote fence lines to check for breaks. They spoke little at first, existing in parallel rather than together. Elizabeth moved from the barn loft to a small bedroom off the kitchen after the 3rd blizzard made the trek between buildings treacherous. Caleb retreated further into himself, spending long hours in his workshop at the back of the house, emerging mainly for meals. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. One evening in January, Elizabeth found Caleb struggling to repair a broken harness, his scarred hands clumsy with the fine needlework. Without a word, she took it from him and completed the task, her fingers deft and sure. He watched her work, his usual scowl softening into something less guarded. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My mother taught me. She said a woman who can't mend is at the mercy of those who can." Caleb nodded. Smart woman. She was. Elizabeth tied off the thread and handed back the harness. Your mother, is she still living? No. He ran his fingers over her stitching, testing its strength. Lost both parents in '64. Typhoid. You were young. 17. Old enough to enlist. His mouth twisted in a grimace. Thought I'd find glory. Found hell instead. It was the most he'd ever said about his past, and Elizabeth knew better than to press for more. But that night marked a shift between them, a small opening in the wall Caleb had built around himself. February brought a brief thaw, allowing Caleb to ride into town for supplies. He returned with not only the expected flour, coffee, and ammunition, but also a book of poetry, which he awkwardly presented to Elizabeth. Saw it at the Mercantile, he mumbled. Thought you might like something to read besides the Bible. The gesture touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. That night, she read aloud by lamplight while Caleb whittled by the fire, his face uncovered in her presence for the first time. If she noticed how he positioned himself to keep his scarred side in shadow, she gave no sign. By March, they had developed a comfortable rhythm. They ate their meals together, sharing the day's tasks and occasional memories, always carefully selected, never too revealing. Elizabeth learned that Caleb had been a teacher before the war, which explained the surprising number of books in his study. He discovered she had a talent for sketching, and brought her pencils and paper from his next trip to town. Yet, for all their growing ease with one another, certain boundaries remained firmly in place. Caleb never entered her bedroom. Elizabeth never asked about the nightmares that sometimes drove him to pace the house until dawn. Each respected the other's private pain, until the night of the spring storm. It came suddenly, a violent collision of warm and cold air that spawned tornadoes across the territory. Elizabeth was returning from the chicken coop when the sky turned an eerie green-black. The wind picked up with frightening speed, bending the young saplings she'd planted near the house almost to the ground. "Elizabeth!" Caleb appeared on the porch shouting over the rising gale. "Storm cellar!" "Now!" She ran toward him as the first hailstones began to fall, massive chunks of ice that pummeled the earth with deadly force. Caleb grabbed her arm as she reached the porch, pulling her toward the storm cellar at the side of the house. They had just reached it when a roar filled the air, a sound like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them. Caleb wrenched open the cellar door and shoved Elizabeth inside, following close behind as the world seemed to explode around them. The small space was pitch black and smelled of earth and potatoes. They huddled together on the dirt floor, listening to the chaos above, crashing, tearing, a terrible howling punctuated by the sound of breaking glass. "The house," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. Caleb's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Just a house," he said, "can be rebuilt." They sat in darkness for what seemed like hours, until the roaring finally subsided to a heavy rain. Only then did Elizabeth become fully aware of their position, her back against Caleb's chest, his arms around her hands clutching his forearms. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his breath against her hair. She should move away. She knew she should, but something kept her still, a need for human contact that went beyond the terror of the storm. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked, his voice rough in her ear. "No," she said softly. "You?" "I'm fine." But he made no move to release her. Instead, one hand moved tentatively to brush a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes. "Elizabeth," he began, then stopped. "Yes." But whatever he might have said was lost as he carefully disentangled himself and stood. "Storms passing," he said, his voice once again distant. "We should assess the damage." The moment, whatever it had been, was gone. The tornado had torn the roof from the barn and shattered every window in the house, but the structures themselves still stood. It took weeks of backbreaking work to make repairs, during which Caleb and Elizabeth barely spoke beyond what was necessary. The intimacy of the storm cellar had unsettled them both. Caleb withdrew further into himself, often riding out for hours under the pretense of checking fence lines. Elizabeth threw herself into restoring the garden, which had been stripped bare by the hail. It was during this time that the letter arrived, delivered by a passing cattle driver who'd picked up mail in Bitter Creek. Elizabeth recognized the handwriting immediately. Martha Wilkins, her mother's cousin from Denver. She read it with growing disbelief. Martha had been trying to locate Elizabeth since learning of her parents' deaths. She offered a home, a position in her millinery shop, a chance at a respectable life among family. Elizabeth should have been overjoyed. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, saying nothing to Caleb when he returned that evening. For 3 days, she carried the secret knowledge that she could leave, should leave, this isolated ranch and the scarred, silent man who owned it. For 3 days, she tried to convince herself it was the sensible choice. On the 4th day, Caleb found the letter. He never admitted to snooping. Perhaps it had fallen from her pocket. Perhaps she had left it where he would find it. Regardless, he confronted her as she was hanging laundry in the yard, his expression more closed than she had seen it in months. "When do you leave?" he asked without preamble, holding out the letter. Elizabeth took it slowly. "I haven't decided that I will." Caleb's laugh was harsh, disbelieving. "Don't be a fool. This is your chance." "My chance for what, exactly?" "A real life, not this existence." He gestured around at the ranch. "A future." "I have work here," she said quietly. "Work you took out of desperation." His voice hardened. "I'm releasing you from our arrangement. You're free to go." Elizabeth felt anger rise in her chest, swift and unexpected. "Free to go," she repeated, "as though I've been your prisoner?" "You know what I mean." "No, I don't think I do." She stepped closer to him, chin raised. "Do you want me to leave, Caleb? Is that what this is about?" He looked away, his scarred profile rigid. "What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me." The words hung between them, charged with everything unsaid during the long winter months. Caleb's hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "You deserve better than this place," he said finally. "Better than—" He stopped, unable to finish. Elizabeth waited, heart pounding. When he remained silent, she turned away, gathering the empty laundry basket. "I'll be gone by morning," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. She was halfway to the house when his voice stopped her. "My wife and daughter died here." Elizabeth froze, then slowly turned back. Caleb stood where she had left him, looking suddenly old and very tired. 8 years ago, he continued, the words emerging as if each caused him physical pain. "While I was still at war. Influenza. By the time her letter reached me, they were already buried on that hill." He nodded toward the rise beyond the corral, where Elizabeth had noticed 2 small markers among the wildflowers. Sarah was 23. Emma was 4. His voice broke on the last word. "I came home to an empty house and their graves." Elizabeth set down the basket and moved toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I'm telling you this so you understand," he said. "There's nothing for you here. No future. Just a half-dead man and ghosts." "Caleb!" "Pack your things," he cut her off. "I'll take you to Bitter Creek tomorrow. You can catch the Denver stage from there." He walked away, his back straight, his steps measured. A man who had said all he intended to say. Elizabeth packed little. She had arrived with almost nothing and would leave the same way. The few items Caleb had given her, the book of poetry, the drawing pencils, she left on the kitchen table with a note of thanks. She kept only what was truly hers: her father's watch, her mother's wedding ring, the letter from Martha, and one other thing, a sketch she had made of the ranch house in early spring with Caleb standing on the porch, his face turned toward the distant mountains. She had just closed her carpetbag when a knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Caleb with instructions for their morning departure. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged, sturdily built with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes. Behind her loomed Caleb, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hargrove," the woman said briskly. "I'm Abigail Winters. Dr. Winters, if you're being formal, which I generally ain't." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "Doctor?" "Trained at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania before coming west," the woman said with a touch of pride. "Now I tend to folks from here to the Montana line." She glanced around the small room. "Caleb says you're leaving tomorrow." Elizabeth looked past her to Caleb, who avoided her gaze. "Yes." Dr. Winters nodded thoughtfully. "Shame. He's been different since you came. Better." "Abigail," Caleb warned. The doctor ignored him. "I've known this stubborn mule since he came back from the war. Watched him bury himself out here with his grief." She fixed Elizabeth with a penetrating stare. "First time I've seen him allow anyone close in 8 years." "That's enough," Caleb said sharply. "I asked you here to check Elizabeth before her journey, not to meddle." "Did you now?" Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you asked me here because you finally realized what's been staring you in the face." An uncomfortable silence fell. Elizabeth looked between them, confused. "I'll wait in the kitchen," Caleb muttered finally, withdrawing and closing the door behind him. Dr. Winters sighed. "That man," she said, shaking her head. "Brave as they come in battle, but a coward when it comes to his heart." She set her medical bag on the bed. "Now, let's have a look at you. Journey to Denver's no small undertaking." The examination was brief and professional. As the doctor packed away her stethoscope, she paused. "You care for him," she said simply. It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth answered anyway. "Yes." "Enough to stay, knowing what you know now." "About his wife? His child?" Elizabeth hesitated. "He doesn't want me to stay." What Caleb wants and what Caleb needs are rarely the same thing. Dr. Winters closed her bag with a snap. "He told you about Sarah and Emma. He hasn't spoken their names to another soul since the funeral." She eyed Elizabeth appraisingly. "That tells me all I need to know." "What should I do?" The question slipped out before Elizabeth could stop it. The older woman smiled slightly. "I can't answer that, but I will say this. Sometimes a person needs to be reminded that grief isn't the only thing left in the world." She moved to the door, then paused. "I've left something for Caleb on the kitchen table, a letter that came for him in town. He should read it tonight." With that cryptic statement, she departed, leaving Elizabeth alone with her half-packed bag and tumultuous thoughts. Dinner that evening was a silent affair. Elizabeth had prepared a simple meal of venison stew and biscuits, Caleb's favorite, though neither acknowledged this fact. They ate without speaking, the only sound the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. When they finished, Elizabeth rose to clear the table. As she reached for Caleb's bowl, her eyes fell on a sealed envelope beside his place, the letter Dr. Winters had mentioned. "You haven't opened your letter," she observed. Caleb glanced at it dismissively. "It can wait." "It might be important." He shrugged but made no move to take it. Elizabeth finished clearing the dishes, aware of his eyes following her as she moved about the kitchen. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she turned to face him. "Why did you tell me about your family today, after all this time?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "You had a right to know why you should leave." "Is that the only reason?" He looked away, his hands restless on the tabletop. What other reason would there be? Elizabeth took a deep breath. Perhaps because you wanted me to understand you, to know you. There's nothing to know, he said harshly, nothing worth knowing. I disagree. Her quiet certainty seemed to unsettle him. He stood abruptly, moving to the window where the last light of day cast long shadows across the yard. Read your letter, Caleb, she said gently. I'll finish in here. For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he snatched up the envelope and tore it open with more force than necessary. Elizabeth busied herself with the dishes, giving him privacy as he read. The crash of a chair being overturned made her whirl around. Caleb stood in the middle of the kitchen, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face ashen beneath his scars. Caleb, what is it? He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. She lied to me, he whispered. Who? Sarah. He thrust the crumpled paper toward Elizabeth with a shaking hand. My wife. Elizabeth hesitated, then carefully smoothed out the letter. It was dated March 15th, 1879, 8 years earlier, and addressed to Dr. Abigail Winters. Dear Abigail, I write in strictest confidence as a patient to her doctor and as a friend. The child I carry is not my husband's. In my loneliness during Caleb's absence, I betrayed our marriage with a man who has since left the territory. I am 3 months along and terrified of what will happen when Caleb returns from the war and discovers my shame. I beg you to destroy this letter after reading it, but I needed someone to know the truth in case something should happen to me before Caleb's return. The influenza sweeping through the region has already claimed several in Bitter Creek, and I fear for myself and Emma. If the worst should come to pass, I ask only that you ensure Caleb never learns of my betrayal. He has suffered enough in this terrible war. Let him remember me with love, not hatred. With deepest regret. Sarah Blackthorne. Elizabeth looked up from the letter, stunned. Dr. Winters kept this all these years. Why give it to you now? Caleb laughed, a broken sound without humor. Because she's as meddling and stubborn as she ever was. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. 8 years I've been faithful to a memory. 8 years of penance for not being here when they needed me. Elizabeth set the letter aside and knelt before him, gently pulling his hands away from his face. You loved them. That hasn't changed. Hasn't it? His eyes were fierce with pain. Sarah was carrying another man's child when she died. She betrayed me, lied to me, and I've spent 8 years blaming myself for her death. You lost your daughter too, Elizabeth reminded him softly. Your grief for her was real. I don't know what's real anymore. He looked at her with naked vulnerability. Except you. You're real, Elizabeth. You've been the only real thing in my life since you walked onto my land. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest. I'm still leaving in the morning, she said quietly. Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked. Of course, I understand. No, you don't. She took his scarred hands in hers. I'm leaving because you told me to go. Not because I want to. Caleb stared at her, confusion giving way to dawning hope. What are you saying? I'm saying, ask me to stay, Caleb Blackthorne. Not as your housekeeper, not out of pity or gratitude or obligation. Ask me to stay because you want me here, with you. For a long moment he was perfectly still. Then his hands tightened around hers. Stay, he whispered. Please stay. Elizabeth smiled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes. Spring bloomed across the Wyoming plains, painting the land in wildflowers and tender green grass. On the hill beyond the Blackthorne Ranch, 2 weathered markers stood among the blue bonnets, Sarah and Emma. Blackthorne, still remembered, still honored, but no longer the ghosts that haunted the living. Beside them now stood a small wooden cross marking another grave, that of Elizabeth's father, whose remains Caleb had helped her retrieve and rebury beside his new family. A gesture of healing for them both. In the ranch house below, windows stood open to the sweet spring air. Inside, Elizabeth sketched by the fire while Caleb read aloud from a book of poetry. His voice, once so rarely heard, now a familiar comfort in their shared home. They had married in a simple ceremony in Bitter Creek the previous month, with Dr. Winters as their witness. The townspeople had been shocked. First, that the reclusive Caleb Blackthorne had taken a wife, and second, that he no longer hid his scarred face from the world. "Let them look," he had told Elizabeth when she asked if he wanted to wear his scarf. "I'm not ashamed anymore." Now, as twilight settled over the ranch, Caleb set aside his book and watched his wife work, her brow furrowed in concentration as she captured the likeness of a mountain bluebird that had nested in their eaves. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Elizabeth looked up, smiling. "What is it?" He handed her a small leather pouch. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a chain. "It was my mother's," he explained as she opened it to find it empty. "I thought, perhaps someday it might hold the face of our child." Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with tears as she looked up at the man before her, no longer the bitter recluse who had once fired warning shots at trespassers, but a man reborn through love and forgiveness. "It's perfect," she whispered, closing the locket and holding it to her heart. "Like our new beginning." Caleb drew her into his arms, his scarred face untroubled in the fading light. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the plains, carrying away the last ghosts of the past and whispering promises of the future to come.